strategy for Lithuania. As you have heard, this conference will be recorded, so whenever you want to have a look at it once again, you will be able to do so. So I'll give you a few words about the skill strategy for those who will hear about the strategy for the first time. Lithuania, in cooperation with the OECD, started developing the National Skills Strategy. Its objective is to identify the key possibilities, to draft the recommendations to increase the efficiency of the Lithuanian education system, which means that we will have to know what challenges we have to overcome to ensure that Lithuanian people, students, could have better possibilities for a lifelong learning, to develop their skills, to gain new skills, to update their skills, so that they could have the skills that are relevant for the ever-changing labor market. Last year, the government of the Republic of Lithuania, and of course, many precise people behind the project helped start the project. I'd like to thank Lukas Savickas, who was behind the initiation of this project. During the entire project, the OECD has cooperated with Lithuania and other interested parties. As I see, part of the people who have registered for the conference have also participated in many consultations. Unfortunately, since due to the COVID situation, we were not able to meet. We had to meet remotely. We had remote meetings in Zoom in spring and in autumn, and I'm grateful to everyone for your contribution, for your insights, so that we could have a more efficient skills system. The skills strategy for Lithuania has been drafted. They were followed by the recommendations. The Lithuanian working group, comprising of trilateral Council and other institutions, provided their own recommendations as to how to improve the recommendations and the analysis. That these analyses will be presented in late spring, and I hope that this presentation will be done live rather than remotely. The Strata, the Government Strategic Analysis Center, is working behind this strategy. And now I'd like to give the floor to the Managing Director.
Ačiū, Danguolė, sveiki visi. Iš tiesų yra labai gera sveikinti šią konferenciją. Šį pristatymą. Manau, kad šitas projektas ganėtinai išskirtinis yra ir toksai net ir savotiškai simbolinis, jisai savotiškas tiltas yra tarp dviejų vyriausybių. Jisai yra kartu tiltas tarp 2 dešimtmečių, nes projektas ir pats buvo išvystytas dar 19 metais kaip koncepcija ir jo visas tas aparatas metodologinis yra praėjusiam dešimtmetį, bet jis kartu tiesia perspektyvą, ryškina perspektyvą maždaug 10 metų į priekį, ką daryti su įgūdžių sistema Lietuvoje. Manau, kad projektas iki šiol buvo tikrai sėkmės pavyzdys, tam tikra sėkmės istorija. Vien tik tai tas faktas, kad pavyko sutelkti tiek kertinių partnerių. Labai dažnai mūsų projektai yra, kaip ir tampa nuosavybė tų agentūrų ar organizacijų, ar žinybų, kurios juos vykdo, ir paskui prasideda viskas įsigimsta taip, kad projektas tampa savitikslis ir daromas pats savo. Šiuo atveju nuo pat pradžios mums pavyko užsitikrinti, kad projektas dalyvautų ne tik tai Švietimo ir mokslo ministerija, kuri atrodytų, kad yra jau arčiausia įgūdžių problematikos, bet Lygiai taip pat intensyviai dalyvavo ir ekonomikos ir inovacijų ministerija, ir socialinės apsaugos ir darbo ministerija, ir kas yra tikrai reta finansų ministerija. Buvo vienas iš iniciatyviausių dalyvių, kurie prisidėjo prie projekto gimimo, labai stipriai rėmė. Ir taip pat vyriausybės centras, kaip ir minėto vicekancleris tuo metu ir premjero patarėjas Lukas Savickas. Tai buvo labai sutelktas darbas nuo pat pradžių. Man labai taip pat svarbu, atrodo, ir reikalinga paminėti, kad nuo pat pradžių mums sėkmingai pavyko įtraukti trišalę tarybą. Reiškia, iškart socialiniai partneriai įsijungė ne šiaip savo tokią formalių tokių kažkokių dekoratyvinių tokių elementų, kad kartais pasikvietė, aptari, pristatai, bet tai buvo struktūruotas partneris su visa jėga ir su visais statyminiais įgaliojimais. Man atrodo, kad tai yra be galo svarbu. Ir taip pat tas sėkmės dalis yra tai, kad dabar šiais metais pasikeitus vyriausybėms mes turime patį pirmąjį pristatymą Lietuvos Respublikos Seime. Tai reiškia, Seimas pripažino svarbą šito projekto, jisai savotiškai kaip ir gal net tam tikrą prasme perima iniciatyvą arba globą projekto, dėl to profesoriui Žukauskui ypatingai didelis ačiū, didelė padėka. Na ir be abejo, jokia sėkmė nėra amžina, jinai turi būti užtikrinta ir toliau. Tai manau, kad nuo mūsų šito tolimesnio renginio, nuo jo sėkmės taip pat priklausys ir projekto tolimesnis gyvavimas. Ir labai norėtųsi, kad tas įgūdžių kategorija tikrai įeitų ir pakeistų mūsų politikoje tokias fragmentuotas kategorijas, kaip koks nors ten mokymasis visą gyvenimą ar profesinis mokymas, kas iš tikrųjų, tai yra tikrai sistemų pavadinimai. To, ko mums reikia, tai reikia įgūdžių, skaitant ir socialinius įgūdžius, bet taip pat ir darbinius įgūdžius ir gebėjimą mokytis ir pagaliau net ir tam tikrus gal savivokos įgūdžius. Taip, kad čia tikrai yra apie ką kalbėti ir šitą perspektyvą atveria nepaprastai svarbius dalykus mūsų valstybės ateičiai. Tai dabar formuojantis programai vyriausybės, kurią tvirtins Seimas, manau, kad yra labai tinkamas laikas apie tai kalbėti ir pagalvoti, kaip panaudoti šito projekto įdirbį. Ir labai profesionalių kolegų iš EBPO atliktą darbą. Tai yra taip pat neabejotinas sėkmės komponentas. Tai ačiū už galimybę pasveikinti dalyvius ir vėl perduodu žodį Danguolei. For the opportunity to welcome the participants of the conference, and now I'd like to give the floor back to Danguolė. Thank you, Mr. Vilunas. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Artūras Žukauskas, Chair of the Committee of Education and Science, and at the same time to thank him for giving the time for us to present this strategy at the meeting of the committee at the video conference. So I give the floor to you, Professor, and I encourage you to participate actively in the debate that will follow the presentation by the OECD representative. Thank you, Danguolė. As far as I understand, I can now speak English. Well, it's up to you. It depends on how you want to do this. Okay, thank you. Then I'll start in my native language. Let me welcome all the members and participants at the meeting of the Committee on Education and Science. Well, whatever is being developed, it has its own roots, and it definitely includes skills. Among those skills, there are various competencies, literacy, and development of certain characteristic features. The challenges of the 21st century are particularly important now because the world has changed tremendously in the last decades. The world has become very fast, and it has left
its mark on the skills paradigm. Today, as we know, we are still debating on the concept of the national education in Lithuania and on the costs of for the students. As we know, the costs allocated for the students in Lithuania are among the lowest costs among the OECD countries, which means that we have to develop the skills that are needed for the 21st century. We do not we have to develop not only the skills of young people, we also have to engage adult people as their education and upskilling is becoming even more important. The skills are also changing very rapidly, and old professions disappear while new professions emerge. That's why we have to respond to the rapidly changing environment in a complex world. And to respond to that, we need to take a new approach. I hope that this presentation will help the lawmakers to include the recommendations into the laws to come and into the national agreement on education in Lithuania. I do hope that this meeting will serve the purpose, and since we have our English-speaking people, I'll speak English now.
Experts of OECD and participants of this meeting that is devoted to the Lithuanian skills strategy. I believe that we highly need today to reconsider our strategy in the formation of skills, in the involvement of adults and enterprises into the formation of skills and using these skills at the workplaces and managing all these things. So I hope that the presentation will be highly useful for the both for the members of parliament, but also for other stakeholders of this program, because the rapidly changing world and the complexity of the present world pose very big challenges for many countries, but especially for such countries as Lithuania that undergo rapid transformations and face these challenges, and we need some strategies to manage these challenges. So let me wish you good success for today's meeting, and I hope that we will make use of this presentation. Thank you.
Ačiū labai profesoriui Švietimo ir mokslo komiteto pirmininkui pasveikinusiam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for welcoming our participants in both languages, English and Lithuanian. But I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that if you need interpretation, there are two icons on the right on which writes interpretation. So whenever you want to hear Lithuanian interpretation, press French and you will hear Lithuanian one. Well, we know that in the most recent Zoom version, the Lithuanian interpretation can be provided, but since we are not sure whether you have the recent version, please press French for the Lithuanian interpretation. And if you want to put forward a question, turn on your microphone and ask in whichever language you want.
And the time is yours. Good luck.
Laba diena. Sveiki, thank you very much, Professor Sukauskas, for welcoming us here today at the committee's meeting. Thank you to Giedrus and Danguali for your introductions and indeed the cooperation over the last year. I will start sharing some slides now, so bear with me a moment. And also like to greet all the committee members today, vice ministers, members of parliament and colleagues, many of whom have been involved in this project in a valuable way already. My slides should be coming up now on the screen. And here you will just see Danguali's instructions for interpretation repeated one more time. So press the interpretation button and choose French or Lithuanian. So today I will provide some background on the project and then share some key findings and recommendations from our draft report. And I do hope to keep this presentation to about 30 minutes so that we have some Q&A time at the end. So why is the Skills Strategy project important for Lithuania? Let's start by looking at what we mean by skills. The term skills can mean different things to different people. Often people think of technical and professional skills, such as skills to be a factory worker, an engineer, or computer programmer. And we do mean these skills, but we also mean cognitive and meta-cognitive skills, such as literacy, digital literacy, critical thinking, etc. But also social and emotional skills, including perseverance, self-organization, empathy, skills that appear to be becoming even more important in this day and age. Megatrends are transforming the skills that people need for success in work and life. Globalization is creating a more integrated world characterized by the expansion of global value chains. And we find from our research that the skills of the population determine to a great extent where a country is able to position itself along these value chains. Demographic change, not an unknown force in Lithuania, such as emigration, but also population aging, which is resulting in the shrinking of the working age population. This means that people's skills and productivity are becoming even more important as drivers of Lithuania's growth. And finally, technological change is reshaping how we work and live. It is transforming the skill requirements of jobs and even how, when, and where we learn. And this trend in particular is critical for Lithuania, as Professor Sukauskas said earlier, a rapidly changing and complex world. In Lithuania, many jobs are at risk of being automated in the future. The OECD has calculated that about 20% of jobs in Lithuania face a high risk of being automated, and another 42% face significant changes due to automation. This is partly due to the fact that relatively less automation has already occurred in Lithuania compared to other OECD countries, and it also reflects Lithuania's large manufacturing sector. So Lithuanians will need to develop new skills, either to adapt to changes in their existing jobs or to find new jobs altogether. And when thinking about these megatrends together, of course, the coronavirus pandemic has indeed interacted with them in various ways, accelerating the digitalization of teaching and learning, and at least in the short term, slowing trends of globalization. The impetus for getting skills right is amplified by the coronavirus pandemic. This graph shows how Lithuania's unemployment rate has evolved during the global financial crisis right up to the present day and the coronavirus crisis. Despite the unprecedented government support measures and investments in Lithuania in response to the pandemic, Lithuania's unemployment rate peaked at over 10% in September, the highest rate since 2014. Government stimulus has prevented this going as high as the global financial crisis, but unemployment still exceeds Latvia, Estonia, and OECD countries on average. Young people have been the hardest hit. The unemployment rate for youth soared to 27% in October, compared to only 14% in Latvia and OECD countries on average. So Lithuania's skills policies must help address this short-term crisis whilst also supporting long-term prosperity and resilience. So what is this skills strategy project, and how can Lithuania utilise this project to help navigate these trends and challenges? The OECD skills strategy is a policy framework that helps countries to take a comprehensive and integrated approach to skills policy making. It consists of 3 dimensions. Number 1, developing relevant skills across the life course, which focuses on developing strong proficiency in a broad set of skills and developing those skills that are most in demand in the labour market and society. And this takes a lifelong learning perspective. It includes skills developed in non-formal education and training and through informal learning as well. But developing skills is just the first step. Number 2 is realising the full economic and social benefits of investments through using people's skills effectively in workplaces and society. And finally, success in developing and using people's skills requires strong governance, such as effective coordination, information and financing, which is the 3rd dimension. The philosophy of the OECD Skills Strategy Project is to take a whole of government and cross-sectoral approach, because we believe that this gives countries the greatest chance of successfully implementing needed reforms. So on the OECD side, the team is not just me, and I'm pleased to be joined by my colleagues, Sam, Bart, and Daniel, who have helped write the draft report and will be available for the Q&A time later. We have drawn on a wide range of knowledge and expertise from across our organisation. And of course, Lithuania's national project team is quite diverse, as you see here, coordinated by Strata, drawing on 4 ministries, the Office of the Government and the Tripartite Council. So we thank and we commend Lithuania's national project team for its approach to this project and active participation along the way. But the engagement does not stop with government. Since developing and using skills is a shared responsibility, the OECD has consulted with dozens of non-government stakeholders in the course of 2 virtual missions representing employers, employees, education and training providers, learners, civil society and others. And here is just one screenshot from a Zoom meeting we held in May of last year. So where are we in the project timelines? Well, we are nearing the end, as Danguali said, and we have just received feedback from the national project team on the draft report, which we are thankful for, and we look forward to going through in detail. And of course, we also welcome any feedback from the committee members in the discussion time today or afterwards via Strata. So what did we look at in the report? We have focused our analysis and consultations on 4 priority areas. Number 1, equipping young people with skills for work and life. 2, raising adults and enterprises' participation in learning. 3, using people's skills more effectively in workplaces. And finally, strengthening the governance of skills policies. Across these 4 priority areas, we have considered developing key competencies, including in non-formal learning, and reducing skills imbalances. So I will now go through each of these with more of a focus on the first 2, given the focus of the Parliamentary Commission on education and skills issues. Equipping young people with skills for work and life is central to Lithuania's vision for a learning society that is modern and dynamic and ready for future challenges. Lithuania continues to expand young people's enrolment at all levels of formal education and training, and it has made significant investments in non-formal learning as well. Yet, young people's skill levels and labour market outcomes could be improved further in Lithuania, especially for youth from disadvantaged backgrounds. Lithuania could do a better job at equipping young people with cognitive skills as the foundation for lifelong learning. So in the OECD's Programme for International Student Assessment, PISA, you see that 15-year-old students in Lithuania scored below the OECD average in all three domains, reading, mathematics, and science, in 2018. Furthermore, the skill levels of Lithuania's recent graduates are not consistently high according to the OECD's survey of adult skills. So for example, in 2015, looking at recent VET graduates from upper secondary education, they had lower literacy skills and lower problem-solving skills than VET graduates in most other OECD countries. And unlike in most other OECD countries, in Lithuania, the skill levels of upper secondary graduates and even tertiary graduates are not actually that much higher than the skill levels of lower secondary graduates by international comparison. So in Lithuania, studying longer has not consistently led to higher levels of broad skill sets. Rural students perform relatively poorly in Lithuania. Again, in PISA, students from rural areas perform about 70 score points lower than students from urban areas, which is shown in the yellow bar on this chart. Across the OECD on average, this gap is equivalent to almost 2 years of schooling. However, Lithuania is one of the few countries in which this result actually reverses when controlling for differences in students' socioeconomic status between rural and urban areas. So what does that mean? It means that rural students actually outperform urban students from the same socioeconomic background slightly, which means that measures to support teaching and learning in rural schools are indeed having some effect. However, the clear priority remains for Lithuania to reduce the effect of young people's socioeconomic background on their skills development. And finally, graduate outcomes could be improved. In Lithuania, employment rates for recent VET graduates are relatively low, as you can see in the left figure. Employment rates for recent tertiary graduates are above the EU average, despite recent declines, as you see in the figure on the right. In fact, Lithuania has among the largest employment gaps between VET and higher education graduates in the OECD. And furthermore, many graduates are not successfully finding well-matched and high-skilled jobs. For example, 1 in 5 Lithuanian university graduates with bachelor degrees ended up in low-skilled jobs in 2018. And only 9% of recent VET graduates end up in high-skilled jobs in Lithuania, which is the lowest rate in the OECD. Now, the reasons for this are many, both on the demand and the supply side. And as we saw before, the coronavirus pandemic has lowered job prospects even more for Lithuania's most recent graduates. So what is inhibiting the skills of young people in Lithuania, and what can be done about it? Raising students' performance in the school years and equipping them with the skills needed for success in work and life requires, among other things, a modern and effective school curricula. Lithuania's general curriculum framework for primary, basic and secondary education had several weaknesses, with some subjects being less demanding than those subjects in other OECD countries, others being overcrowded with content, and transversal skills lacking in some subjects. And indeed, this may have contributed to the results you see in this figure, which shows that Lithuania's youth have relatively low levels of collaborative problem-solving skills. Now, Lithuania is updating the curriculum framework Yet during our project, we did hear some concerns about this reform. For example, some reported that transversal competencies like socio and emotional competencies are not clearly defined or widely understood in the educational community, and teachers and school leaders perhaps have not been as closely involved in the curricular design as they could have been. Indeed, it is essential to have teachers and school leaders on board with such reforms, especially because students from disadvantaged backgrounds tend to be hurt most by poorly implemented curricula. Also, current student assessment practices in Lithuania do not complement the new curricula as yet, because assessment focuses on subject matter knowledge more so than cross-cutting competencies. And furthermore, Lithuania is not yet realising the full potential of non-formal education to complement school curricula. So in order to successfully implement and complement modern curricula, our draft report recommends that Lithuania actively engage with education stakeholders to ensure the successful implementation of the new curriculum, especially in disadvantaged schools. For example, through collaborative networks between schools and municipalities and an interactive curriculum website. We recommended modernising student assessment practices to complement and assess the competencies in the new curriculum. For example, refreshing the Matura exam and complementing it with ongoing or formative assessment, but also aligning higher education admissions to the curricula. And finally, we recommended better targeting non-formal learning programs and vouchers to students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Equipping young people with higher levels of skills also depends on capable and empowered teachers and school leaders. However, Lithuania has struggled to attract, train and empower teachers in recent years. So for example, in this chart from 2018, we see that Lithuania has both the oldest teaching workforce and the highest share of younger teachers wanting to leave teaching in the OECD. Also, only 15% of Lithuanian teachers think that their profession is valued in society. At this time also, teachers were highly dissatisfied with salaries, and salaries and progression have not been closely linked to teachers' responsibilities or performance appraisals, rather being more so linked to tenure. So we heard during this project that Lithuania's system of initial teacher education has lacked flexible pathways and delivery modes to attract highly skilled students, but also to attract mid-career professionals with real industry experience into teaching. There also appears to be a shortage of high quality CPD, continuous professional development, for teachers and school leaders. For example, relatively higher shares of teachers and school leaders in Lithuania report not being able to find relevant professional development. In 2018, Lithuania enacted a wide range of reforms to raise quality of teacher pre- and in-service training, to increase teachers' salaries, etc., which most of you will be familiar. On the positive side, we already see that enrolments in initial teacher education shot up in 2020, yet the full impacts of these reforms are yet to be seen. So in order to strengthen Lithuania's teaching workforce, we recommend better targeting, evaluating, and gradually increasing public funding for continuous professional development. For example, this could involve mandating individual learning plans for teachers, linking those more systematically to professional development, and developing a quality assurance system as a basis for raising public investments over time. We recommended that Lithuania make initial teacher education studies even more accessible with multiple pathways, delivery methods, and incentives, including through better recognising the motivation and skills of teaching candidates apart from their academic scores and formal qualifications, and to continue improving teachers' career progression opportunities, especially in disadvantaged schools. For example, by linking salaries more closely to teacher responsibilities and appraisals, and even the socioeconomic profile of their student base. And the final opportunity here is related to making vocational and higher education more responsive to labour market needs in order to better equip young people with skills for work and life. So currently, public funding arrangements for higher education and VET do not appear to create strong incentives for institutions and students to meet labour market needs. The formulas for calculating the value of the student basket is largely based on the estimated costs of provision and not linked to labour market needs. And unlike in almost all other OECD countries, in Lithuania, the process for determining the number of state-funded places in different VET and higher education programs is highly centralised and could introduce distortions in the supply and demand of programs. Indeed, Estonia moved away from this model in recent years. Now, despite expanded student places and some lowering of admission standards in recent years, it seems that disadvantaged students still remain underrepresented in higher education, particularly those who have gone through vocational tracks in secondary school. So we think that funding and admissions policies could work better together to support disadvantaged students, specifically to access programs that meet labour market needs. And finally, cooperation between employers and institutions has not been strong or systemic, especially in the provision of work-based learning to students. So for example, in 2016, almost 30% of Lithuania's upper secondary VET graduates under the age of 34 reported that they had had no work experience during their vocational studies. While many tertiary students work part-time during their studies, Lithuania lacks ongoing monitoring of the extent and quality of this work-based learning for student skills development and their employment. So in order to make education more responsive, we recommended that Lithuania support the system with high quality information on current and anticipated skills needs and universal career guidance services for young people, which is handled later in the governance chapter and will be an even greater focus in the final report. We recommended using public funding to steer higher education and VET enrolments to meet labour market needs. For example, performance contracts with institutions that reward completions by field of study or employment outcomes. Special funding and admission policies and support for disadvantaged students to study and succeed in higher education in fields in shortage. And finally, expanded work-based learning in VET and professional higher education by increasing financial incentives for employers to offer work-based learning. So this would be perhaps building on what Lithuania is already doing with apprenticeships, expanding that to all forms of work-based learning. So that was young people's skills, but as the National Skills Strategy Project takes a lifelong learning perspective, the second priority is raising adult learning. Adult learning, in all its forms and contexts, is essential for boosting the skills of adults and can generate a range of personal, economic and social benefits. Recent strategies and policies in Lithuania have highlighted the need to boost adult learning levels, and various measures have been planned, some implemented. However, participation in adult learning remains stubbornly low in light of the megatrends facing Lithuania and its ambitions for economic development. You see those low participation rates here compared to the EU and neighbouring countries. On the left, in 2016, participation in formal and non-formal adult education over the last 12 months was only 28% of adults, compared to an EU average of 44% of adults. More recent data from 2019 actually tell a similar story, as you see on the right. So according to the European Labour Force, which measures participation over the last 4 weeks, Only 7% of Lithuanians participate in adult learning over that time frame, well below that of most other EU countries. And when breaking this data down further, we see that differences in participation by age, gender, employment status, and education broadly follow international patterns. Participation in adult learning is lowest for older adults, non-employed and lower educated adults, as well as for males. So where does Lithuania stand out here? Specifically in the low participation of young adults, 25 to 34, and among unemployed adults who arguably need training the most. For example, only 3.5% of unemployed people had participated in training in the last 4 weeks in 2019, which was one of the lowest rates in the European Union. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, ensuring unemployed workers have access to training is essential for facilitating the recovery, particularly as unemployment is expected to remain elevated even this year. So what is inhibiting Lithuania's adults from participating in adult learning, and what can be done about it? Increased participation is strongly linked to motivation, and it seems that in Lithuania, a large proportion of adults do lack this motivation. So 67% did not participate and did not want to participate in training, one of the highest levels in the EU. And similarly, for many enterprises, firms see no need to offer training to their employees, and relatively few have training plans in place. So this highlights the need for outreach and promotion, as well as guidance services for adults. So what did we recommend? Developing an online one-stop shop or a portal where individuals can find and compare courses with information on labour market trends and financial support. Also, strengthening the public employment services, career counselling services by leveraging digital tools, specifically to target unemployed adults who need guidance and training opportunities, but also to support small businesses to develop skills development plans to upskill their own employees, starting with perhaps high growth SMEs involved in higher value added activities. But even with effective initiatives to promote adult learning, learners still face barriers. In Lithuania, those who want to learn report time constraints as the main reason to not participating, but also the high cost of upskilling and reskilling is another major barrier. In Lithuania, 43% of adults who want to participate but do not cite costs as a barrier, which is well above the EU levels. So these barriers can be alleviated with more flexible learning and better financial incentives to help cover the costs of training. So we've recommended improving the supply of online adult learning opportunities offered by vocational and higher education institutions, including for unemployed adults. It's particularly important in a time of pandemic. Also expanding Lithuania's voucher system to provide financial support to working adults, not just the unemployed, given the megatrends we see at play. We've also recommended introducing regional or sectoral training funds, financed through a training levy in cooperation with Lithuania's tripartite council. In Lithuania, as in other OECD countries, the majority of adult learning takes place in non-formal education and informal learning. So this is an essential part of any system. It's typically more flexible, responsive, shorter, cheaper. However, it presents specific challenges. One of these is quality assurance. In 2015 in Lithuania, we see that relatively few adults found their non-formal education and training to be very useful for their job, as you see in this chart. Whilst Lithuania has robust quality assurance mechanisms for formal education, ex-ante and ex-post quality assurance mechanisms are lacking for non-formal education. Another challenge is to ensure that adults realise the full potential benefits of their non-formal learning by making their skills visible to employers through skills recognition and validation schemes. Currently, Lithuania lacks a coherent and comprehensive system for recognising skills acquired through non-formal education. So our recommendations include introducing a monitoring framework for learning outcomes of non-formal education, establishing quality labels for training providers of non-formal education who exceed minimum certification requirements, but also developing guidelines for the recognition of non-formal and informal learning to better standardise procedures and methodologies for this recognition between different institutions and sectors. So that was developing skills. And in the last couple of moments, I'll look at using skills and then skills governance. So in terms of using skills, there is growing awareness amongst OECD countries on the importance of increasing skills use, as it has positive effects on worker performance and satisfaction, on the economy and society through productivity, economic growth. And we think this could be part of Lithuania's recovery to the COVID crisis as well. Lithuanian employers do not appear to be using the skills of their workers to their potential. This figure shows that the intensity of skills use in workplaces is lower in Lithuania than in most OECD countries. And the low use of skills is partly driven by a low demand for skills in the labour market. So Lithuania has a relatively small share of businesses in high value added activities such as ICT, finance, professional scientific services. And this is also reflected in the weak average performance of businesses in terms of productivity. Unless Lithuania is able to further stimulate growth and innovation, there are risks to falling in a middle income trap. So better use of people's skills will likely be an important part of this stimulus, of this response. So specifically, what can Lithuania do? It can enhance the use of skills by supporting businesses to adopt high-performance workplace practices. So these are practices that the data show are positively associated with skills use, and they include flexibility, autonomy, teamwork, information sharing, etc. And this figure shows a clear positive relationship between these high-performance practices and skills use, but it also shows that Lithuania is doing relatively poorly on both metrics. So our recommendations include identifying priority sectors to raise the impact of efforts to strengthen the adoption of HPWP, high performance work practices. So better focusing of these measures. Also making support for the adoption of HPWP more targeted to employers' needs. For example, by differentiating on firm size and emphasising mentoring and coaching activities in these support programs. But also we think Lithuania could create a central portal with clear, concise and business-friendly information on high-performance work practices, support available, especially for SMEs. The second opportunity focuses on management and leadership, which is essential for introducing high-performance work practices. And we see a range of limitations with the skill levels and competencies of managers in Lithuania. For example, 22% have low skill levels in literacy and or numeracy, which is relatively high by OECD standards. And training participation by managers is relatively low. So we recommend expanding and improving the quality of entrepreneurship education in the school system, so starting early, developing a strategic vision on how to strengthen management and leadership skills in Lithuania to get the different people, different actors on the same page, but also raising awareness of the benefits of skills use, of high-performance work practices, and training for Lithuania's managers. And finally, employees have an important role in raising skills use and adopting high-performance work practices. But Lithuanian employers report that employees are not highly motivated, much lower, as you see in the first chart, than many other EU countries. And Lithuanian employers also indicate that employees rarely receive interesting and stimulating work, which is the lowest share of all OECD countries. So there are some issues in the workplace in Lithuania that need to be resolved here to realise the benefits of skills investments. So here we recommend encouraging businesses to better engage and empower employees. We give some ideas for that, but also continuing to strengthen workplace and HR practices in the public sector specifically. This is not just about private enterprise. For example, by building on policies from the new law on the civil service and expanding good practices across the public sector. So the last priority here is the systemic one, strengthening the governance of Lithuania's skills system. So by governance, we're talking about coordination and collaboration across the whole of government, engaging stakeholders throughout the cycle of skills policy making, building integrated information systems with good connected information on learning, skills needs and skills outcomes, and using this information in career guidance and evidence-based policy making. And finally, aligning and coordinating financing arrangements for skills. So the opportunities include increasing the capacity of government and non-government stakeholders for a strategic and coordinated approach. And here we recommend that Lithuania increase interministerial coordination through a designated interministerial body with lead authority and responsibility for skills, ensure a close collaboration between this body and the Tripartite Council, and improving the capacity of subnational actors like municipalities and regional development councils to participate in skills policy making. And we give some specifics in the report. Opportunity 2 is on the issue of skills information. And our recommendations here include increasing the capacity of ministries to use evidence in policy making, and also increasing skills foresight exercises by supplementing quantitative information with qualitative data from stakeholders and experts. But also a very important recommendation to implement a system of lifelong career guidance in Lithuania. And this is so important to underpin improvements in the responsiveness of the education system and indeed to motivate more adults to learn, among other things. And finally, the third opportunity is about financing. And in order to ensure sustainable, well-targeted and shared financing, we recommend increasing employer and employee investments in skills policies through a tripartite funding agreement. We think that as part of this, public investment in skills policies could be increased. As Professor Zukauskas mentioned earlier, public funding remains relatively low in Lithuania, and there may be opportunities to increase this. But also reallocating funding could be a major source of resourcing for Lithuania's skills system, in particular expediting the consolidation process of Lithuania's school and higher education network, and increasing inter-municipality cooperation in service provision. This could free up resources to be allocated to more valuable uses across the skills system. So that's our draft recommendations in summary. What's next from recommendations to action. We have done these projects in over 15 countries now, many being in Europe, and several have gone on to second phase projects. So from our experience, we can see perhaps two tracks of where Lithuania could go to from here. We are aware that you are synthesizing many of these findings and recommendations into your own documents and agreements and plans for the next years. Recent experience with Latvia, they decided to continue at the strategy level and asked OECD to support them in a second phase on developing an education development guidelines for the next decade. And indeed, this involved prioritizing skills investments, creating indicators and a monitoring framework to ensure that progress is being achieved throughout the life of that strategy. And it also involved foresight exercises to integrate plausible scenarios for the future into their education plan. The alternative is a deep dive into some of these specific issues. We've highlighted in the report, Slovenia and Portugal took deep dives in their second phase projects with us. Slovenia on the governance of adult learning to address fragmentation in that system and find efficiency and effectiveness improvements. Portugal also on adult learning, but perhaps more of a quality assurance monitoring angle. So for Lithuania, what could this be? Perhaps implementing a lifelong career guidance system or developing a tripart funding model for adult learning, amongst many other opportunities. So I should stop there. Please feel free to contact us directly or via Strata if you would like to continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, for wonderful presentation of OECD's Lithuania Skills Strategy. I'm sure many of us got a lot of information and insights, and I would like to ask Professor Artūras Žukauskas, the Chairman of Education and Science Committee of the Parliament, to chair the discussion. And just to remind in Lithuanian, kas norėtų lietuvių kalbą kalbėti, tai neužmirškite paspausti mygtuką.
Those who want to speak Lithuanian will have to turn on the microphone and choose the respective icon.
Žukauskas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Danguolė. So thank you to Ben. It was an impressive presentation, and I hope that we will make use of it. But just to go on, we will start a question session, and I just invite our participants to give questions to the presenter and or some short comments. So, grįžtant prie lietuvių kalbos, aš kviečiu dabar dalyvius.
Coming back to the Lithuanian language, I encourage the participants to provide questions, to give questions to Ben, and maybe to comment on the things that have been said during the presentation. Please raise a virtual hand so that the moderator, Žukauskas, could see who's willing to speak.
I see a hand of Kasparas Adomaitis, member of the Party of Liberty. So please, Kasparas.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the presentation. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So thanks again for the interesting presentation. I had the question on the dissatisfaction of teachers at their work. Lithuania is lagging well behind other countries compared to other OECD countries. Would it be possible to state that low pay rate is the reason behind the low motivation of teachers to stay a job and low teacher attraction to schools? Or maybe we can find some other countries where pay rate is also low, but yet the status of teachers in the society and their overall motivation is still high. So in other words, is pay rate the only reason for low motivation, or there might be some other reasons as well?
Thank you. Perhaps we can take 2 or 3 questions and I'll handle them at once just to be more efficient. So thank you. I've taken note of that.
Okay, then please, Mr. Tomas Bičiūnas, member of our committee, also has a question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting and comprehensive. What are the differences of Lithuania in the context of other countries? In what is Lithuania unique, and what are these features that Lithuania could exploit? Thank you for the question.
So I will give a short question. So my question is about the strategy, actually. You presented a lot of recommendations, and we know that in this country we usually lack resources to follow all recommendations. And so my question is about strategy, which is not about what to do, but what not to do. So I mean that we need to find the critical levers that can be used for meeting all these recommendations. What are, to your opinion, these critical levers?
Thank you very much. So maybe I'll just chime in there with some initial answers. So is salary the only problem? Absolutely not. It has come up in the teacher and school leader surveys as a major issue. But indeed, last year's salaries were increased in Lithuania. And so now by international standards, they are looking much better. And as I said, we have seen an increase in the most recent year of enrollments in the teaching profession. But for example, now you have an issue where perhaps school leaders' salaries have not increased to the same extent. So are there still strong incentives to attract the best school leaders? We definitely heard throughout this project that there are a lot of the non-financial issues are very important, and we touch on those in our report. And so that is about empowering teachers, for example, making use of high levels of autonomy and making better use of performance appraisals, rewarding with higher responsibility, higher progression, etc., and even better quality training. So yes, it's part of the problem, but it's not the only problem. What are the differences with other countries? What makes Lithuania unique? What could Lithuania exploit? Well, I hope you start to see some of the differences with through the comparative data, but certainly I think being a small country, there are advantages there in, we think, improved vertical coordination between the centre and the municipalities. And we have seen examples, for example, of, let's say, the decentralisation of VET to the local level, vocational education and training. And I think that's one area where this sort of decentralisation with effective guidance, coordination and resourcing is something that Lithuania could indeed exploit. On the other side, one of the unique things is the high reliance on European funding. So we've addressed that issue in the report and tried to suggest alternatives to that reliance and the negative consequences that might arise from that reliance. Yes, now what to do with all these recommendations? What would a strategic approach look like? Well, in many ways, we think continuing what you're doing with the national project team. There has been, from our perspective, very useful coordination and cooperation there, and much discussion on what are the relative priorities of these recommendations. The levers that are going to be important, financing, as you've said, and that's why we've made recommendations about how you might A, free up existing resources to reallocate, and B, generate new fundings, for example, through agreements with social partners. But also, we think improving the evidence base on what is working in Lithuania in skills programs and skills measures is essential, because without that evidence base, it is very difficult to justify the continuation of EU-funded projects that appear to be successful. So for the sustainability and the continuity of successful programs, we think the evidence base is critical here as well. But finally, the Skills Policy Council that we've recommended would be a vehicle for continuing this conversation and seeking to turn it into action.
Thank you, Ben. So, are there any more questions? Ar dar yra kokių klausimų? Prašom drąsiai kelt rankas.
Anyone willing to ask a question? Please raise your hand. If you want to ask a question, please raise a virtual hand, because I can't see everyone on the screen.
Press raise hand. Press button raise hand. So I see the member of our committee, Dalia Sanavičiūtė, is raising just hand.
I'm very sorry. I have no idea why, but I can't see any option to raise hands. So if you don't mind, I can ask the question from OECD review of labor market, which has been made in 2018, and this states that we have as Lithuania quite a big immigration through these years, and this states that Lithuania should invest additional efforts to strengthen links with all Lithuanians abroad, especially those with medium skills and skills levels or employed below their education level. So, and this report states as well that a lot of young people who were unemployed before leaving the country because they just left the school, they maybe gain some skills abroad, some education abroad. And what would be the measures, what would be the tools to attract those young people and recognize their skills here in Lithuania? And what would help integrate into the labor market those with lower skills? And as we know, I think only 10% abroad, they are working according to their skills and education gained here in Lithuania. And others, about 80% works below their skills. So they lose some they lose they gain the experience, but not according to their education. So then they're coming back to Lithuania. They can't be recognized as professionals according to their diploma. So what would be the suggestions to integrate those people, to recognize their skills and to help them to feel safe and welcome here in the country? Thank you.
Thank you for questions. I see that Ben is waiting for more questions, and tiem, kurie neranda kaip pakelti ranką, tai reikia spausti.
Those who cannot find the raise a hand button, just look below with the participant icon. So you should be seeing the raise hand icon. I see that Beata has already risen her hand. Beata Petkevich is a member of our committee. I have a question, if I may. Thank you, Ben, for your presentation. And I have a question about the leadership skills. How would you recommend solve this issue, and which countries should Lithuania look up to?
About leadership and how to improve our skills in the field of managing and leadership, because actually this is usually very important when you want to perform some changes. So everything depends on the leadership of the people who manage. Any more questions? Dar klausimų? So, Ben, could you answer?
Yes, thank you. So before we get to the question on how to improve leadership skills in Lithuania, and specifically what countries could Lithuania look at, I'm going to hand that question to one of my colleagues, Bart, who wrote the skills use chapter. I'll handle Dalia's question on citing the previous labour market review by the OECD. So emigration as a topic was not a focal point of our study, but very much part of the context for the skills policy recommendations that we have made. So Lithuania does have a situation of high mismatch between people's skills and the jobs that they work in currently, and also low skills use in workplaces. So these issues affect the ability to absorb the skills of returning, let's say, high-skilled migrants specifically. So we think that our recommendations to reduce mismatch, for example, through better career guidance, more systemic career guidance, through recognition of prior learning, whether that's formally or non-formally or informally acquired, could help on that front. But also, the specific recommendations regarding skills use also touch on the need for managers, for workplaces, for HR departments to better understand the skills of the workforce in order to utilise them more fully and more effectively. So we're recommending publicly supported programs that might actually offer those services to SMEs specifically, which would then create benefits for absorbing, say, returned labour. So I think I'll hand over to Bart on the question about what to do, how to raise leadership skills and who to look at, who to follow on this front.
Thank you. So yes. I see no more questions. So
sorry, I'll just, if it's okay, my colleague Bart will answer the second question.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Sorry, thank you very much, Ben. Yes, I can briefly discuss a little bit what I've been describing in the chapter on skills use. So I was the chapter author. So yeah, in that chapter, I really described in detail the challenge of raising the skills of managers and leaders. And I touch upon sort of three main elements. So first is actually raising the profile of this challenge. I think in conversations in workshops and in group discussions, we notice that people are aware there are several initiatives already, but there's a broad kind of challenge to kind of raise the awareness of this topic. And I think one of the main issues that are proposed is a recommendation on developing a strategic vision. So bringing together all the different elements that are in place and kind of create a standard plan for all stakeholders and all involved to move forward and to improve in the skills of managers and leaders. The second point is on entrepreneurship education. This was a topic that we discussed in detail in many meetings, and Lithuania already has several initiatives. Including through junior achievement, for instance. But there were various elements how entrepreneurship still could be improved. to kind of make it, to improve the quality of entrepreneurship education, to make it a more important, broader part of indeed the curricula, and also to build on already some national and international best practices, for instance. And the third point is again on raising adult learning for indeed managers and leaders. And what we see is that the participation rate is quite low of managers and leaders. There's no culture, particularly in smaller firms, to kind of continue to learn throughout life. So we've developed several recommendations on ensuring that that there's an efficient supply of relevant and flexible learning opportunities. And particularly flexible is very important, because really one of the main barriers to participation is actually that managers simply don't have time to learn. So providing more online learning opportunities could be a way to move forward. And also one of the last points is enhancing the willingness of managers and leaders to learn, because low motivation to participate is also one of the main drivers behind the low levels of skills. So those are sort of the main elements. And in the chapter I describe various kind of other international examples. For instance, from Poland. In Poland, the main agency, PARP, that supports businesses, has a whole range of sort of online learning opportunities for managers and leaders targeted to SMEs. And I think indeed it provides a very good example of sort of a public program to kind of support this specific group of learners. And also in Ireland, there's a SkillNet, which is an organization that provides training to all sorts of businesses, but it has a very specific focus as well on learning and programs for managers and leaders. So these are some examples, but of course in the chapter I describe also other elements and other examples that could be relevant. I hope this answers the question.
Thank you, Bart. And I see one more question from a member of our committee, Mrs. Ieva Kaczynskaite.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for presentation. It was very interesting and very useful. I would like to ask about maybe I could say kindergartens. You mentioned very briefly in your presentation about preschool education. And I know that in the European Union, we have very different education system. We start differently, schools learn differently. Maybe you have more recommendation which is related to preschool education. Maybe we need to set new age when we have to start mandatory education and etc. So maybe about more about this part of education.
So who can answer?
Yes. Are there more questions, or shall I answer that one?
There's one more question we've received via chat from Mr. Kęstutis Mikolajūnas. Professor, maybe you could invite him to ask the question. We can't hear you.
Ponas Mikolajūnas, ar galit užduot klausimą?
Mr. Mikolajūnas, can you hear us?
Professor, maybe you can read a question if it's written down.
I'll read
the question because it seems that Mikolajūnas has problems, he has technical problems. The question is related to infrastructure. In Lithuania, we don't have the infrastructure for services. We don't have competence assessment centers. The recognition of competences does not operate as well. sometimes for our teachers, it is much easier to allow students pass the program rather than to do something. So the question is whether it is possible to implement the changes with the current infrastructure, with the infrastructure that is available now. So I wonder whether Kęstutis Mikalajūnas is available now or not yet.
And higher education. So we have some connection problems. So Danguolė tried to present the question. So are there any answers for these questions?
Sure. Well, before handing, I think I might hand to my colleague Daniel, who wrote our governance chapter on the questions about infrastructure and to what extent does the current infrastructure and do the current networks of service providers, service centres, are they sufficient to implement our recommendations? And to what extent do we think that you might actually need new infrastructure, new centres, particularly in the regions, across municipalities? I think we've got some insights in Chapter 5 on that. But before that, I'll just touch on kindergarten. So just quickly, early childhood was not a key focus of this report. We had seen some data to show that participation continues to increase, including across regions, although there does remain the specific challenge of participation by young children from disadvantaged families, and also participation below the age of 2. But above that, Lithuania seems to have been making very visible improvements in participation rates. So no, not a main focus, but something I'm sure will come up again in future analyses for Lithuania. And Daniel, would you like to say something on the sufficiency of the current infrastructure?
Yes, thank you, Ben. So my name is Daniel Unterweger. I'm the chapter author of the governance chapter in the report, in the current draft report. I think the question that was asked tackles two different issues. On the one hand, recognition of learning competences, which would rather be an issue, I think, of adult learning or of youth, depending on the level of education, of course. But concerning the infrastructure issue, I think this tackles the very important issue of the capacity of the different municipalities, but also counties in Lithuania. And one important recommendation that tackles the problem of capacity is also mentioned in the governance chapter, where it was identified that indeed municipalities seem to lack their competencies, also partially on, for example, improving quality of education in secondary level schools, for which they are also responsible. And therefore, in the governance priority area, we, for example, recommend to increase the competencies of administration at the municipal level on the one hand, and also propose a better rearrangement, so to say, of the funding structure for municipalities. For example, with speeding up the process of school consolidation and using the means that are freed up in this regard for other better priorities, so to say. And maybe my colleague Sam would say something on the recognition part on adult learning.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Daniel. I'll just say a couple of words on recognition of learning as well, which we discuss in the chapter on adult learning. Certainly, with the current infrastructure in place, Lithuania can definitely improve the recognition procedures. I mean, currently, vocational schools already carry out recognition of non-formal learning, and universities carry out and have procedures in place for the recognition of formal learning. But what we recommend in this report is to standardize those methodologies across institutions to create a clearer structure for recognition across the whole country, which should make recognition easier to understand for learners and for institutions, and contribute to a more streamlined process for recognition. Thanks.
Thank you, Sam. So we have the very last question, and from Mr. Jonas Mickus, and then I will close the discussion. So please, Mr. Mickus.
Labą dieną, ačiū už pristatymą.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation and for the comprehensive answers. I believe the last answer was related to the question that I am going to ask. Lithuanian municipalities are provided with little autonomy. And maybe this has to do with ineffective use of funding. It is very important, as you have mentioned, that majority of institutions have not assessed the competences properly. I believe that your recommendations will serve to improve the things in our country. So my question would be related, how could municipality and government could cooperate, and what government could do to increase the autonomy of municipalities?
So if that's the last question, perhaps again, Daniel might like to speak about some of the recommendations from his chapter on how could municipalities and central government better cooperate and how their autonomy could be better supported by the centre.
Yes, thanks, Ben. Sorry, I just had to change the settings for translation. So thanks, Ben. Indeed, the topic, I think, of municipalities' responsibilities and competences is a very important one. I think maybe there are two sides to the question. So on the other hand, how far should the autonomy of municipalities go? So one thing we've heard also in the discussions was that, for example, giving municipalities also a power to raise taxes could be one solution. Also to set better incentive for the municipalities, so to say, on how to spend these funds that could be gathered. But on the other hand, research has also shown that giving such lower level governance units like municipalities, also tax authority can, on the one hand, it can be beneficial in the long term, but on the other hand, this is mostly confined to high income countries with already well existing governance structures. And it is also a problem that this would be more of a very long term goal for Lithuania, so to say. So in terms of the report now, the solution we basically proposed, which I think was also part of discussions already in Parliament, to my knowledge, to give incentives municipalities to consolidate their school network, and that if this consolidation progresses, the financial means that are freed up in that way are not reduced for the municipalities, but that they have then the autonomy to spend this on the issue of skills policy in general. So to spend the financial means that are raised by increasing the consolidation of the school network to their personal priorities, so to say, but within the policy area of skills policy, which would be in the governance chapter, the second last opportunity, if you want to look it up in the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So we are closing our questions session, and I would like to thank to the presenters and to those who post questions. And now I think we are going to some concluding remarks. So Danguolė, can you present any concluding remarks?
Thank you very much, Professor Artūras Žukauskas. I will finish with Lithuanian language. I thank
everyone for the participation in the discussion and the presentation. I thank my colleagues from OECD and for having presented the Skills Strategy project in great detail. I'll share my screen on where you should and whom you should contact, me in particular and Strata in general, if you have any suggestions or recommendations or questions. The project is running to its end. The last question demonstrates how it depends on Lithuania. This is important, and I hope that the debate will continue. I thank Artūras Žukauskas, chair of the committee, for the time and the meeting during the committee meeting. I thank everyone, and let me share the screen so you can contact me at any later stage. Thank you so much. See you next time. Thank you, Danguolė. I continue in Lithuanian. I thank all the participants and OECD experts. I thank Strata. I thank those committee members who provided questions. Some of the recommendations will definitely enter our agreement on education, but the basic problem is the skills management, and this is the providers of skills.
The problem of trainers, kad tiek tie, kurie suteikia tas kompetencijas, tiek tie, kurie valdo tas kompetencijas.
This is about the problem of managers and providers of skills and coordinators of skill provision. I truly hope that this presentation was important and useful, and as I've said before, we will integrate that into the National Agreement on Education and its future. We will use some of the recommendations in the implementation action plan.
And I hope that we will use your recommendations both in our National Agreement on Education and in the program or in the plan of implementation of the government's program. And I hope that we will meet in the future, because as I've understood, this is not the very end of the project, and we will have some continuation of that. So thank you again, and you are welcome to join us again in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Artūras Žukauskas. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.